All right, so this is a review of Chapter 1, which was an introduction to anatomy and physiology. You have a test coming up, so hopefully this isn't the first time you're looking at it. But we're going to do a quick run through of everything we've talked about in this chapter. So we started off with the basics that biology is a study of life, and in order to be considered a living thing, there are 7 characteristics that an organism needs. Those characteristics are they have to be able to reproduce, they're made of cells, they respond to stimuli, they grow and develop, they have metabolism, which means they're able to obtain and use energy, they adapt, and they're able to maintain homeostasis. We then went into a branch of biology, which is anatomy and physiology, what this course is all about. And anatomy is a study of our body structure, so the parts of our body. So when we're thinking about anatomy, we can be thinking about our stomach, our eyes, our skin are all examples. Anatomy can be broken down into 2 subcategories of gross anatomy, which is things on the large scale, and microscopic, which is on the smaller scale, which includes cytology, the study of cells, and histology, the studies of our body's tissues. So in this course, we're also going to look at physiology, which is a study of how our body functions. So physiology is a little more difficult than anatomy because it's looking at the actual processes, like the actual process of digestion and how that works in order to help your body maintain homeostasis. When we're looking at physiology, that's why it's so important that we have that chemistry and biology background so we can understand those complex processes. We also talked about how our body is organized, or the levels of organization, starting with the smallest level being the chemical level, followed by the cellular level, and a group of cells then makes a tissue, a group of tissues makes an organ, a group of organs makes an organ system, and a group of organ systems makes an organism. While we're on this page, I want to talk about organ systems for a second. We have 11 organ systems or body systems. We kind of looked at some of these when we did our body systems poster. I would be familiar with those 11 systems and the basic function of each. So your systems are your cardiovascular system, skeletal system, muscular system, endocrine system, reproductive system, digestive system, nervous system, immune system, urinary system, respiratory system, and the integumentary system. We then discussed the difference of quantitative and qualitative data when discussing the health of a patient, and we went over that a sign is the objective physical indication of diseases, which would be something that the doctor measures, like your temperature or your blood pressure, whereas a symptom is a subjective experience of the patient or how they're feeling that day. You might say that you are feeling nauseous, or you have a headache, or have a sore throat. So with this data, we talked about different ways we can diagnose patients. We looked a lot at diagnostic imaging. When you're reviewing diagnostic imaging, I would just know the main function of each type, that x-rays are a way that we can view our bones, barium contrast x-rays are a way that we can look at our GI tract or your digestive tract. CT scans are going to take multiple x-rays of a patient and piece them together for a clearer image. We use MRIs to look at the soft tissues like our muscles and organs, where PET scans are used to measure the metabolic activity of our brains. Ultrasounds look at the structure of our internal organs, and DSA scans are going to look at how blood flows through an organ. All of these types of imaging, well, most of them actually, are going to use some type of radiation. So with radiation, first we have to understand what an isotope is. And an isotope is a form of an element that has a different atomic mass due to different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus. Those different numbers of neutrons causes the nucleus to become unstable, which leads to the emission of radiation. Along with radiation, you have to be familiar with what a half-life is. The half-life is the amount of time it takes for 50% of that radioisotope to decay. Then we got into what I consider to be a little more fun. We got into the anatomical terminology. So with anatomical terminology, it's really important to remember what anatomical position is. That a person is standing facing you with their palms facing forward. And then we just reviewed the basic terms that we use to describe a body. You have anterior ventral, which is referring to the front of your body, and posterior and dorsal, which is referring to the back. You have superior, which is referring to the upper portion of our body or above, and inferior, which means below or towards the bottom of our body. If a person is in supine position, they're laying on their back. If they're in prone position, they're laying on their stomach. Remember that the patient's right and left is opposite of yours. Proximal means closer to the point of attachment or closer to their torso. So for example, your shoulder is proximal to your elbow, whereas distal means further away from the point of attachment. So your wrist is distal to your elbow. We discussed superficial and deep. Superficial means towards the surface of the body, or deep means more internal. And we also added the terms medial and lateral, medial being towards the middle of the body and lateral being towards the sides of the body. You do not have to memorize every single one of these anatomical landmarks. I would just be, if one pops up on your test, it'll be an easier one like nasal, which means nose, or oral, mouth, carpal, which means wrist. You'll see these all throughout the semester. Here's some more. Abdominal pelvic quadrants, just be familiar with the different ways that we can separate our abdominal pelvic region. We can do it into the 4 quadrants, or we can also do it through abdominal pelvic regions. This is our kind of out of place slide. Auscultation is just the study of listening to body sounds, like listening to your heart or your lungs, whereas a heart murmur is just an unusual heart sound. Back into our anatomical terms, we have sectional anatomy, which is just ways that we can divide or cut the body. You have the frontal or coronal section, which separates the body into anterior and posterior halves, or into front and back. Sagittal is going to divide the body into right and left halves, and transverse divides the body into superior and inferior portions, or into your top and bottom. We then talked about our body cavities, which are just how we describe the regions of our body that contain our organs. These cavities are going to be filled with fluid called serous fluid. They're going to have organs, which are called viscera, and those organs and our body cavities are going to be lined with serous membranes. So there's 2 big, broad categories of a body cavity. You can have the dorsal body cavity, which is in the back. It's going to include your brain and spinal cord. And then we have the ventral body cavity, which are all the cavities found in the front of our body. So with our ventral cavity, you can find the thoracic cavity, which is your chest. The thoracic cavity is going to include the pleural cavity, which houses your lungs, and the mediastinum, which is where your heart is. And remember, your heart is surrounded by a membrane called the pericardium. The abdominal pelvic cavity is also in the ventral body cavity, and it just contains the abdominal and pelvic regions. The abdominal cavity is going to contain most of your digestive organs, like your stomach, your liver, your pancreas, whereas your pelvic cavity is going to include some of your digestive organs, like your large intestine. It's going to contain your urinary organs, like your bladder, and your reproductive organs. And just remember that all of these organs are surrounded by a membrane called the peritoneal membrane. Homeostasis is the way that our body maintains a stable internal environment. We want to keep our body at its normal range or its set point. So when our body fails to achieve homeostasis, that's when we get diseases. It can result in illness, and in the most extreme cases, even death. So to understand homeostatic regulation, we have to understand the parts of a homeostatic feedback mechanism. So the parts of homeostatic regulation, we have our receptor. The receptor is part of our body that's going to detect a change from normal. When that stimulus gets applied to our body, it detects the change, and it's going to send that message to the control center, which is our brain or our spinal cord, and that's going to determine the response. Ignore the bell. And the effector is going to be a muscle gland that creates the response. And just remember that the set point is our body's normal range. So the set point for our body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. These are just pictures going over homeostasis. So thermoregulation is one of the easiest ways to explain homeostatic regulation. Thermoregulation is just how our body maintains its temperature. Like I said, the set point is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so an example is, let's say the stimulus is you walk outside and you feel a cold breeze. The receptors in your skin are going to detect the change. They're the receptor. They send the message to your hypothalamus in your brain, which is the control center, which then causes your muscles to start shivering, or the effector. Now, this is an example of negative feedback because negative feedback is defined as a type of response which causes an opposite reaction or eliminates the stimulus. The stimulus is your cold, and your response is you're going to try to warm yourself up. Whereas stimulants are chemicals that act to raise the activities in your body. So they're going to intensify all the activities. And positive feedback is described as amplifying the stimulus. When a stimulus is applied, it gets amplified, and we're going to keep going with that stimulus. A big example is blood clotting, and another good example that we talk about with positive feedback is childbirth. Then we went into IVs and how they help maintain homeostasis. If your body's a little out of balance, you might get an IV if you're sick, which stands for intravenous therapy, and that just delivers fluids directly into our veins so they can reach our bloodstream. With IVs, this is where it becomes important to understand osmosis and cell transport because we want to make sure that we're giving our patient fluids that have the correct water solute balance so we don't cause more illness. And then we quickly discuss the cell cycle. Remember, cell division is how our body is able to grow. And then you're going to need to know a little bit about Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. So for chemistry, you need to be familiar with the definition of isotopes, which we discussed earlier, what a half-life is, the definition of an atom. And for biology, know the components of the cell theory. Be familiar with different parts of the cell, basic parts like the nucleus, mitochondria, etc. Know what ATP is and where it's made in the cell, and be familiar with the steps of protein synthesis. So that's a wrap up of Chapter 1. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck on your upcoming test.